The next Torah portion is called Vayeira, which means he appeared. The portion begins with Abraham recovering from his circumcision at the age of 99. And Abraham is sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day, and that's when God appears to him. That's where the word Vayeira appears. And after that statement, it appears that there are three men who appear to Abraham. So even though they're described as men in the first part of the narrative, and they later are described as angels, it seems as if there's kind of a visionary quality to the whole encounter that begins with God appearing to Abraham, which is by definition a prophetic experience. When Abraham sees them, he rushes toward them and implores them to stay a while. They can wash their feet, drink some water, have a feast, and then go on their way. And they agree. And he prepares a big meal with the assistance of his wife, Sarah, and their son, Ishmael. The three angels appear to eat. They ask where Sarah is, and then begin to describe how at this time next year, Sarah will have a son. So at that time, Abraham's 99 and Sarah is 89. Sarah is listening to this conversation in her tent, and she laughs. It's interesting how the theme of laughter reappears in this whole story of Isaac. When God first tells Abraham that he will be having a son, Abraham laughs. When Sarah is told that they will have a son, she laughs. And the name of Isaac is derived from the Hebrew root zachak, which means to laugh or to jest. Once the meal is complete, Abraham sends off the angels. Only two of them apparently take off. The third seems to disappear. And in a gesture of hospitality, he walks them part way to their destination. This mention of Abraham accompanying his guests during the initial part of their departure has informed me to do the same thing whenever possible when I have guests. That is, I walk them to the car or walk them up the driveway on their way out. It's good policy. There's an interesting little episode where God is asking someone if he should keep from Abraham his plans to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, especially because God has promised Abraham the covenant, and Abraham is a good person and his role model. There's the notion of Abraham being faced with a number of tests during his life, and the whole notion of God testing individuals is kind of paradoxical if God is all-knowing and is aware of the outcome of the test. But the person who is being tested does not know the outcome. And that's one of the reasons that God is actually described as testing these people, and they go through a test. So in a way, the episode that follows is God seeing, determining, testing whether Abraham's compassion is up to the challenge. So God tells Abraham that he's about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, or at least he's going to be investigating whether the outcry coming from Sodom and Gomorrah really reflects the magnitude of the sinfulness of those cities. So when Abraham learns of this, he then argues with God. He first pleads with God to spare the cities on account of 50 righteous people. If 50 righteous people are found in the cities, will God spare the cities? And God agrees to. At that point, because Abraham's not so sure that that many righteous people will be found, he gradually bargains God down to 10. And God agrees that if 10 righteous people are found, he will spare the cities. Abraham's approach is interesting. In a way, he tries to shame God by saying, "Aren't you the most righteous and just God? And if you are righteous and just, how could you treat the evil and the wicked the same? If the evil people are the ones who ought to be destroyed, Why would you wipe out the entire communities? So God acquiesces or accedes to this argument, or seemingly, and the debate ensues. So once the minimum number of righteous people is agreed upon to be 10, the 2 angels left from the 3 meet Lot at the gate of Sodom. And Lot, like his uncle Abraham, greets the strangers and invites them in to stay with him overnight, as it's getting late in the day. Interestingly enough, the angels refuse at first compared to the 3 who readily agree to partake of Abraham's invitation. In this case, Lot has to ask twice, and he promises them a meal and drink and lodging. Once the townspeople learn of the presence of the guests in Lot's house, they surround the house and ask Lot to release the men in order for them to know his guests. And the word know is variously interpreted to be sexual relations. There's to know, there's to lie carnally, to lie a laying of seed. The expression to know, denoting sexual relations, occurs in the case of Adam and Eve when they bear or beget their 3rd child. But it's not that common an expression for sexual relations. But it's pretty straightforward in this case that the men of Sodom want to have sexual relations with Lot's guests. Now, there's a lot of debate about what was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah that God wanted to wipe out all of those 5 cities from the plain of the Jordan. And the more specific instance of a lack of generosity or a meanness to the stranger is actualized or is represented or symbolized or kind of distilled in this particular encounter. But the prophets Ezekiel and Jeremiah later on describe the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah as basically lack of generosity, lack of sharing, lack of compassion, lack of looking after the stranger. The plain of the Jordan at the time was a beautiful, lush geographical area. And so they lived in a state of great abundance, but apparently they were quite stingy with their sharing. So there's a number of contrasts that the commentators try to make between Lot and Abraham. And one of those contrasts is exemplified by Lot replying to the men of Sodom saying, "Please don't molest my guests, but I've got 2 virgin daughters. And if you'd like, I'll bring them out to you and you can do whatever you want to them." And the men say, "No, forget it. We want your guests." So this doesn't really shed much of a positive light on Lot. But I guess in a way it bespeaks his great ability to be a host. So he pleads, and the men try to assault him, but the angels grab Lot, close the door, and strike the men of Sodom with blindness, and they grope helplessly to get to the door. So this is pretty much the last straw, and the angels tell Lot that they're about to destroy the cities and to prepare to escape, to get his wife and his daughters and his sons-in-law ready to leave by daybreak. For whatever reason, Lot dilly-dallies, and the angels really need to press upon him to get ready to get out of there. Even so, in the beginning or the first stages of the escape, he does not want to go to the mountains, which is where the angels tell him to flee to. He would rather stay in one of the smaller towns in the plain of the Jordan. So they begin fleeing. The wife of Lot turns around, despite the admonition of the angels to not turn around during the destruction of the cities. And a result of her turning around, she's converted or transformed into a pillar of salt, which is an enigmatic episode, that's for sure. There's a lesson to be had with Lot's wife turning around and being transformed into a pillar of salt. It's a lesson that we can take into our psychedelic experiences. In other words, if an angel, a being that you trust and respect and believe, gives you advice, you should follow it. If it says don't turn around, then don't. Or do so at your own risk. So there's fire and brimstone coming down from heaven that then destroy the cities of the plain. Abraham wakes up the next morning, looks down, and there's smoke arising from the plain like the smoke from a kiln. At first, Lot and his 2 virgin daughters flee to the smaller town in the plain, but then quickly move back up to the mountains where the angels originally asked him to go, and they move into a cave. Now, the daughters are afraid there are no more men in the world, kind of like what happened after the flood with Noah. And they want to continue the human race, and they decide to get pregnant from their father Lot. So they get him drunk. The firstborn gets him drunk one night. They have sex, but he doesn't remember anything. The next night, the younger of the 2 daughters sleeps with him after they get him drunk, and she conceives as well. The naming of the children teaches a lesson in, I guess, modesty perhaps. The name the firstborn daughter gives to her child is based on the words "from my father," which ultimately becomes the word Moab, and that child is the progenitor of the Moabites. The younger daughter apparently is more modest, and she calls her son Ben-Ami, which means the son of my people. And that child becomes the progenitor of the Ammonites. Those are both non-Canaanite people. So after all of this, Abraham moves down to the south, which is the home of the Philistines. Now, comparable to the episode in Egypt when Sarah and Abraham flee there because of the famine in Canaan, the king of the Philistines is called Abimelech, which is kind of like the name Pharaoh. It's just a generic name for the king at that time. The Pharaoh of Egypt, the Abimelech of the Philistines. So likewise, what happened in Egypt is this time the king of the Philistines abducts Sarah, who they describe, Abraham and Sarah, they describe themselves as siblings in order for Abraham to be spared being murdered, in order for the king of the Philistines to marry Sarah. As long as he's considered a brother, they'll let him live, and he will give permission for Abimelech to marry Sarah. So God appears to Abimelech in a dream, a prophetic dream. Now, this points to the interesting aspect of you don't need to be a full-blown prophet to experience the prophetic state. Depending on the time, the place, the person, the circumstances, God will appear to non-prophets if there is a need. So God appears to Abimelech and tells him to release Sarah, and Abimelech pleads innocent, which is the case. But as a result of Sarah being released, Abraham then prays to God to lighten or to remove a curse that seems to have fallen upon Abimelech and his household, which manifests through no one being able to bear children. Their wombs are closed off. Hard to say what exactly is taking place there. Comparable also to the Egyptian caper with Abraham and Sarah, Abimelech scolds Abraham and says, "What are you doing? Why didn't you tell me the truth? Look what badness you've brought upon me and my people." And as opposed to the episode in Egypt, Abraham responds and states because of his anxiety about the lack of the fear of God in that country, he and Sarah agreed early on during the beginning of their wanderings to describe themselves as siblings. So the king of the Philistines likewise gives Abraham a lot of goods after the resolution of the abduction of Sarah. But as opposed to the king of Egypt who expels Abraham, the king of the Philistines asks him to stay because of God describing Abraham to Abimelech as a prophet And Abimelech would like an esteemed individual like that to settle in his country. And Abimelech, besides giving a lot of goods to Abraham, also makes a pledge to protect Sarah from any of the countrymen. So it's a year later after the visiting of the three angels, and Sarah gives birth to Isaac. She's 90 and Abraham is 100. And again, the root tzachak appears. After Sarah gives birth, she exclaims how people will laugh with her in joy because of her bearing Isaac at such a old age. At a certain point, there's a conflict of some sort between Ishmael, the son of the concubine in Abraham, with Isaac, the son of Abraham and Sarah. And it also involves the root tzachak, which in this case might mean mock or jest or play. In any event, it disturbs Sarah enough that she then expels Hagar and Ishmael. This distresses Abraham because Ishmael is, after all, his firstborn son. But Abraham is told by God to do what Sarah says and not to worry, because Ishmael will be a great nation as well. But the covenant, the promises, which were made to Abraham and his descendants, will be carried on through Isaac, not through Ishmael. So Hagar and Ishmael are expelled. They wander around in the wilderness for a while. Their food and water runs out. And they're about to die before an angel appears and saves them by revealing some water at some distance. So Ishmael grows up. Hagar finds him an Egyptian wife. So the stage changes again to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. Abimelech and his chief of staff approach Abraham and request to make a covenant, basically a non-aggression pact that is specifically for 3 generations. Once they begin discussing this covenant, Abraham feels emboldened enough to complain to Abimelech about the king's servants stopping up the wells that Abraham's servants have dug. That's squared away, and they make a pact. And it's specifically around the wells. The pact seems to be sealed by a gift of Abraham to Abimelech that represents the agreement that Abraham indeed dug those wells, and they're his. Abraham is comfortable enough to decide to stay in the land of the Philistines for some time. Now comes a very difficult part of the Torah. This is called the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac. Lots of people describe this narrative or this episode as the sacrifice of Isaac, but Isaac isn't sacrificed. He's about to be sacrificed, and in the process is tied up and laid on top of an altar, but he's not sacrificed. So this is probably the most difficult of the tests that God poses to Abraham, because Isaac is the son through whom the covenant and the promises will be realized. So God appears to Abraham and says to him, "Take your son whom you love, your only son, and take him up to a mountain, which I will show to you at some point, and make him into a burnt offering." So Abraham, Isaac, and their servants start to walk. And after 3 days, the mountain appears that they are to climb, where Isaac is to be sacrificed. So there's 3 days that elapse from the command to the actual beginning of the performance of the sacrifice. So Abraham and Isaac had plenty of time to talk things over. It wasn't an impulsive decision on Abraham's part. And there's an extraordinarily poignant exchange between Isaac and Abraham as they're walking up the mountain. At a certain point, Isaac turns to Abraham and wonders about what is going to be the sacrifice. We've got the wood, we've got the fire, we've got the knife, but where's the ram? Where's the sacrifice? And Abraham replies, "God will see to the sacrifice, my son." So they're exchanging expressions like my son, my father, my son, my father. So they remain close the entire time. It's an intimate conversation. They mostly are walking up the hill quietly. It's an interesting commentary on Abraham's obedience. After God tells him to take Isaac up to the mountain to be sacrificed, Abraham doesn't argue, he doesn't pause, he doesn't talk to Sarah, his wife. He just takes Isaac, loads the donkey, and they're on their way. So it's pretty close. Abraham ties up his son, puts him on the wood, on the altar, raises his hand with the knife, and is about to kill his son. And an angel of YHVH appears from the heavens and stays Abraham's hand. Now, it's interesting about the use of the different names of God in this situation. It's an angel of YHVH, which is the aspect of God which is compassionate, to which one makes sacrifices, who rewards for repentance, all those things, as opposed to Elohim, which is another name of God, which is more strictly the God of nature, the God of cause and effect, as I discuss in a clip that I recorded recently in my description of God. So the angel of YHVH stays Abraham's hand, and then Abraham looks around, and there turns out to be a ram that's stuck in the bushes by its horns. And Abraham then takes that ram and sacrifices it instead of Isaac. Now, another angel, or the same one, but there's another exchange between Abraham and an angel. And that angel of YHVH tells Abraham that now they know that Abraham is an Elohim-fearing man, the aspect of God that's more strict cause and effect. So it's hard to say what is the exact meaning of the switching of the two names of God in this instance. The Akedah, or the binding of Isaac, is used as a paradigm of the kind of man that Abraham is, in the sense of being an ideal for Christianity, for Judaism, and for Islam. There's a great book by John Levinson from Harvard called Inheriting Abraham, which discusses in great detail the three approaches to Abraham's behavior at the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. The Christian approach is to see Abraham as the paragon of faith. In other words, he continued to believe in the promise, even though he was about to destroy the manifestation of the promise, the thing upon which the promise was to be played out, which is in the form of Isaac. But there isn't any mention of the faith of Isaac living through this. He's going to be sacrificed. The Muslim approach is submission, that Abraham is a paragon of submission, that he just bends to God's will. But that's not Abraham's character. Abraham's character is to be, an advocate. He argues for the survival of Sodom and Gomorrah. He wants Ishmael to inherit him rather than burdening God with having to perform a miracle by them giving birth to Isaac at such an old age. So Levinson, as a Jewish scholar, comes out in favor of this being an example of obedience to God rather than submission or blind faith. So God promises or reiterates the promise of the covenant at this point once more, that Abraham will be blessed and that he'll have an innumerable number of descendants. Now this portion ends with the announcement to Abraham of some children being born. These children are born to Abraham's older brother, Nahor, in Mesopotamia. And the timing is interesting. Maybe Nahor's wife also bears at a late age, miraculously. In any event, there's a nephew of Abraham, Bethuel, who begets Rebekah, and that is the woman who Isaac will ultimately marry in the next few portions. So this is definitely an intense chapter with a lot of iconic narratives the angels appearing to Abraham, the promise of children in old age, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the sojourning of Abraham in the land of the Philistines, and then the Akedah. It ends on a hopeful note, which is that Rebekah has been born, and she, as Isaac's future wife, the two of them will then continue the lineage in the person of Jacob. But the portion for next week, Chaye Sarah, the lives of Sarah, begins with the death of Sarah, which, the timing can't be a coincidence. So it may be that when Sarah heard what was going on the mountain with the Akedah, that caused her to die. But in any event, the next Torah portion begins with Abraham looking for a burial plot for Sarah. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe to my channel. And until next Torah portion, take care. Bye.